What if the aircraft that decided the outcome of World War II was not the heavy bomber filling the sky nor the sleek fighter dueling high above? The clouds but a hybrid machine born from desperation and necessity. And how did this transformation permanently change air warfare forever? Watch to the end and you will have that answer. In the late 1930s, as Europe drifted toward another global war, military planners believed they had already solved the puzzle of air combat. The doctrine was clean, simple, and rigid. Fighters existed to hunt enemy aircraft and protect the skies. Bombers existed to fly deep into enemy territory and destroy factories, cities, and infrastructure. This separation of roles shaped every air force in the world, and every aircraft factory followed the same logic: speed and agility for fighters, payload and endurance for bombers. There was little room for compromise and almost no imagination for a machine that could do both. Before the Second World War fully erupted, air warfare was still influenced by theories born after the First World War. Italian General Giulio Douhet and other early air power thinkers argued that bombers would always get through and that wars could be won by striking the enemy heartland directly. Fighters were seen as necessary escorts but not decisive weapons on their own. Ground attack was considered a secondary task, risky, inefficient, and better left to artillery. This belief dominated British, German, and American air doctrine as the world moved toward conflict. In September 1939, as German forces surged across Poland, the skies reflected this old thinking. German bombers flew in organized formations, targeting railways, airfields, and command centers, while fighters focused on air superiority. The campaigns moved fast, but even then cracks appeared. Ground forces advanced so rapidly that bombers struggled to keep pace with targets that changed by the hour, yet the rigid separation remained largely unquestioned. The Battle of Britain in 1940 became the defining early test of traditional air warfare doctrine over southern England. German Heinkel and Dornier bombers crossed the Channel aiming for radar stations, airfields, and cities. British Spitfires and Hurricanes rose to meet them in fierce dogfights. This was aerial combat as the world understood it: fighters versus fighters, bombers versus defenses. It was dramatic, costly, and decisive in its own way. Britain survived, but the battle also revealed limitations. Fighters could defend airspace, but they could not directly shape the battlefield below. Bombers could destroy fixed targets, but struggled against mobile forces. As the war expanded across Europe and into North Africa, the nature of ground combat changed dramatically. German Blitzkrieg tactics emphasized speed, surprise, and coordination. Tanks, motorized infantry, and artillery moved faster than ever before. Front lines shifted daily, sometimes hourly. Commanders needed immediate air support, not strategic bombing days later. Yet bombers required careful planning, long flights, and fixed targets. Fighters had speed and flexibility, but lacked the ability to strike ground targets effectively under traditional doctrine. This mismatch became increasingly obvious during the early years of the war. Armored columns slipped through gaps, supply convoys moved at night, and battlefield opportunities vanished before bombers could respond. Ground commanders began calling for aircraft that could react instantly, strike precisely, and still defend themselves in hostile skies. Existing doctrine offered no solution. Even as these problems mounted, many Air Force leaders resisted change. Fighters were considered too valuable to risk at low altitude where anti-aircraft fire was intense. Bombers were considered too slow and vulnerable to operate close to the front lines. Were drawn not only on maps, but in the minds of generals and engineers. Yet reality refused to cooperate. In France in 1940, Allied forces experienced the consequences of this rigidity. German ground units coordinated closely with aircraft, creating a terrifying sense of unstoppable momentum. While German dive bombers struck bridges, columns, and strongpoints, Allied forces often lacked immediate air response. Fighters patrolled the skies, bombers attacked pre-planned targets, but the battlefield demanded something else entirely. Pilots themselves were among the first to recognize the problem. Fighter pilots flying patrols saw enemy vehicles exposed and vulnerable, but were forbidden or unequipped to attack them. Bomb crews received intelligence too late or found targets already gone. War was moving faster than doctrine. By 1941, as the war widened to include the Soviet Union, and later the United States, the pressure intensified on the Eastern Front. Massive armored clashes unfolded across vast open spaces. The Luftwaffe achieved early success, but even it struggled to provide continuous support with aircraft designed for narrow roles. Losses mounted and improvisation became unavoidable. It was in this environment of urgency and adaptation that the idea of a combined role aircraft began to take shape, not as a theoretical breakthrough, but as a battlefield necessity. Pilots started carrying small bomb loads on fighters. Engineers experimented with reinforced wings and bomb racks. Commanders quietly bent rules to meet immediate needs. What began as improvisation would soon become transformation. This first phase of the war exposed a hard truth: modern warfare demanded flexibility, speed, and firepower had to exist in the same airframe. The sky above the battlefield could no longer be divided into neat categories. Air superiority and ground attack were becoming inseparable. The question facing every major power was no longer whether change was needed, but how quickly it could happen and who would adapt fast enough to survive. In the next phase of the war, one nation would demonstrate both the terrifying potential and the fatal weakness of early ground attack aircraft, forcing the world to rethink air combat forever. How did a single screaming aircraft become a symbol of terror across Europe and at the same time expose the limits of early ground attack aviation? And what lesson did it teach every air force in the world? Stay with this story to the end and you will see how fear, innovation, and vulnerability collided in the skies of World War II. In the early 1940s, as German forces surged across Europe, one aircraft embodied the future that many had not yet recognized. The Junkers Ru-87, better known as the Stuka dive bomber, was designed not for air-to-air combat, but for precision strikes against ground targets. During the invasions of Poland, France, and the Low Countries, it became a terrifying weapon of Blitzkrieg warfare. Its shrieking sirens announced destruction moments before impact, shattering morale even before bombs struck. The Stuka excelled at close air support. It could dive steeply, delivering bombs with remarkable accuracy against bridges, bunkers, tanks, and troop concentrations. This precision allowed German ground forces to advance with unprecedented speed. Enemy defenses were paralyzed, communications collapsed, and resistance often crumbled under the psychological assault. For a brief moment, the Stuka seemed to prove that specialized ground attack aircraft could dominate the battlefield. Yet beneath this success lay a critical flaw. The Ru-87 was slow, lightly armed, and poorly suited to defend itself against enemy fighters. Early victories occurred in environments where German air superiority was already established. Once Allied fighters appeared in significant numbers, the Stuka suffered devastating losses. During the Battle of Britain, British fighters cut through Stuka formations with ease, exposing their vulnerability. This pattern repeated itself across the war as air defenses improved and fighter opposition increased. Specialized attack aircraft without strong self-defense capabilities became liabilities. German pilots began flying missions under intense risk, requiring fighter escort that was not always available. Losses mounted and operational flexibility declined. Other nations took careful note. The psychological power of dive bombing was undeniable, but so was the danger of relying on aircraft that could not protect themselves. This forced a fundamental reassessment: should aircraft be built solely to attack the ground, or should they also survive in contested airspace? The answer would reshape aircraft design. The Soviet Union faced similar challenges with its own ground attack platforms, while aircraft like the Il-76 proved extremely effective against German armor. They required heavy armor and still depended on fighter protection. Losses remained high, and the need for flexibility grew urgent. By 1940, the battlefield had become saturated with anti-aircraft guns, faster interceptors, and mobile targets. Specialization alone was no longer enough. Survivability, adaptability, and speed became just as important. As bomb accuracy, air forces began to realize that the most effective aircraft might be those that could fight their way to the target, strike it, and fight their way out. This realization marked the turning point. Experiments multiplied. Fighters were fitted with bomb racks, rockets, and reinforced structures. The line between fighter and bomber began to blur rapidly. The era of the pure dive bomber was fading, and in its place, a new concept was emerging. What followed was not merely technical evolution, but a revolution in battlefield coordination. As the Allies entered new theaters of war, they would take this lesson and transform it into a decisive advantage, turning ordinary fighters into devastating ground attack weapons that could dominate both sky and soil. When air power finally learned to speak the same language as soldiers on the ground, how did that coordination turn ordinary fighter aircraft into one of the most lethal weapons of World War II? And why did this transformation mark the beginning of modern tactical air warfare? Stay with this story and you will understand how innovation under fire reshaped the battlefield. In early 1942, as Allied forces regrouped after painful setbacks, British and American commanders faced a hard reality. German forces had mastered the integration of air and ground operations, while Allied air power remained fragmented. Fighters chased enemy aircraft, bombers struck distant targets, and ground troops often fought without immediate air support. The solution would not come from building entirely new aircraft, but from reimagining how existing ones were used. Britain led the way. Out of necessity, the Royal Air Force began modifying its frontline fighters to carry bombs and rockets. The Hawker Hurricane, once designed solely for air combat, was adapted into a ground attack platform, capable of striking armored vehicles and supply lines. Although no longer dominant in dogfights, the Hurricane found new life attacking enemy columns, airfields, and troop concentrations. The real breakthrough came with the Hawker Typhoon. Initially plagued by technical problems, it evolved into a powerful low-altitude attacker armed with rockets, bombs, and heavy cannon. It could devastate German armor and infrastructure. Its speed allowed it to survive in contested airspace, while its firepower made it a terror to anything on the ground. This combination of survivability and striking power embodied the emerging fighter-bomber concept. Across the Atlantic, the United States Army Air Forces reached similar conclusions. American fighters like the P-40 Warhawk and later the P-47 Thunderbolt were modified to carry substantial bomb loads. These aircraft retained their ability to engage enemy fighters while delivering destructive ground attacks. The Thunderbolt in particular proved nearly indestructible, capable of absorbing damage and returning home while carrying heavy ordnance. The North African campaign became the proving ground for this new approach. Vast open terrain allowed fighter bombers to roam freely, striking supply convoys, fuel depots, and armored formations. Allied pilots coordinated closely with ground commanders, responding to changing battlefield conditions in real time. The results were dramatic. German and Italian forces found their movement restricted, daylight resupply nearly impossible, and morale steadily eroded. In Italy, this coordination matured further forward. Air controllers operated near the front, guiding aircraft onto targets with precision. The distinction between strategic and tactical air power blurred as fighter bombers became an extension of the ground army. Destroyed bridges, stalled retreats, shredded convoys, and relentless pressure wore down enemy resistance. These successes changed doctrine permanently. Air forces learned that air superiority alone was not enough. Control of the air had to translate into dominance on the ground. Fighter bombers provided that link, striking wherever and whenever ground commanders needed support. By the time Allied planners turned their attention toward Western Europe, the fighter bomber was no longer an experiment. It was a proven weapon system central to modern combined arms warfare. The stage was set for its most decisive test on the beaches and hedgerows of France. How did a single class of aircraft help crack open Nazi-occupied Europe, and why did its success ensure that air warfare would never return to its old rigid divisions again? The answer lies in the fields of Normandy and the skies over France, so stay with this story to the end. In early June 1940, as Allied forces prepared for the largest amphibious invasion in history, fighter bombers stood ready to play a decisive role. The lessons learned in North Africa and Italy had reshaped Allied air doctrine. Aircraft like the Hawker Typhoon and the P-47 Thunderbolt were no longer secondary tools. They were central to the invasion plan, tasked with isolating the battlefield, destroying enemy reinforcements, and responding instantly to threats. On D-Day, as troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, fighter bombers roamed overhead, striking coastal defenses, artillery positions, and moving columns. Inland German commanders struggled to move forces during daylight. Roads became death traps, rail lines lay shattered, and supply convoys were hunted relentlessly. Air superiority was translated directly into battlefield paralysis. As fighting pushed inland, the challenge became even greater. The hedgerow country of Normandy restricted visibility and movement. German armored units attempted to counterattack from concealed positions. Fighter bombers proved essential, using rockets, bombs, and cannon fire. They could strike tanks hidden among trees and sunken lanes, often guided by forward air controllers. They delivered precision attacks that ground artillery did not achieve. Operation Cobra in July 1940 marked the apex of fighter-bomber effectiveness. Allied aircraft hammered German positions, breaking open the front and allowing American ground forces to surge forward. While heavy bombers participated, it was the constant presence of fighter bombers that maintained pressure, preventing regrouping and escape. Beyond Normandy, the pattern repeated across Western Europe, from the Falaise pocket to the advance across France and into Germany. Fighter bombers dominated the battlefield. German units moved by night, abandoned vehicles, and suffered chronic shortages. The psychological impact matched the physical destruction. Air attack became an ever-present threat, shaping every decision. By the end of the war, the transformation was complete. The rigid separation between fighters and bombers that defined pre-war thinking had vanished. In its place stood the multi-role aircraft capable of air combat, ground attack, and reconnaissance. This concept carried directly into the jet age, influencing aircraft like the F-60F for Phantom and beyond. World War II had forced innovation under fire. The fighter bomber emerged not from theory, but from necessity, proving that adaptability could decide wars. The hybrid aircraft that once seemed an improvised solution became the foundation of modern air power.